The soldiers inside the armored vehicle sounded uncomfortable. The tension was palpable in the air and could be felt in the cold sweat that soaked their uniforms and balaclavas. Among them, Oleg saw that it would be his turn to take the initiative. There was a life waiting for him. The Bradley's door opened, creating a ramp to jump out. There, in front of him, was a minefield. A land of suffering awaited him, not to kill him, but to tear parts of his body away and bring suffering to him and despair to those who would watch him groan on the ground. It had happened to others just a short while before, and one of his comrades was still farther ahead with one of his limbs torn off, the last one waiting to be rescued. The combat medic prepared himself, said his final prayers, and jumped while fate rolled its dice to decide where his life would land where death was sown. The battlefields never stopped feeding on lives, fear, and hatred. The men who walked the land heard in the distance the roar of destruction, warning that thousands of dollars were being spent to tear apart another body or cause millions in losses by destroying some important equipment. Day after day, the war machine operated with money flowing between men who were far away from where death and blood flowed profusely. That was the fate of the conflict in Ukraine. The year 2023 moved at a different pace around the world. For Ukrainians, the days flew by as international pressure mounted for a victory as decisive as the one from the previous year. The first counteroffensive swept the Russians from much of the map, leading to embarrassing claims of a tactical retreat. Now, because of that success, the Ukrainian army found itself lost in toxic pressure to launch an assault against the lines the Russians had prepared for a year. That wouldn't be the same challenge. The Ukrainians trained in several countries. Their men formed new brigades, handling various weapons and learning NATO tactics to fight against the Russians. Western propaganda flooded the screens with images of military equipment that was touted as the salvation in a complicated war, in which the last major victory for one side was the capture of Bakhmut, which had cost so many lives in months of fighting, and both sides were still debating its strategic importance. If during the fall the West said that maybe the effort wasn't worth it, now that the Ukrainians were fighting on the flanks and had achieved victories to encircle the city, the Russians said it wasn't that valuable after all. The Ukrainians knew they had to face a killing field to try to drive the Russians out of their territory and reach Crimea. The men dreamed, the media spread stories of war and heroism while, with their feet on the ground, commanders sweated, trying to figure out how to fight a prepared enemy that could no longer be surprised. The Ukrainian forces began to gather in locations that were no surprise to the Russians. Zaporizhia was not the most famous stage of the war. Bakhmut had taken over the whole story in recent months. That didn't mean the Russians were unaware that this oblast was one of the most obvious places to be attacked in the counteroffensive. The flanks of Bakhmut were still seeing intense fighting, leading many troops to be moved to the region, but there was no shortage of soldiers to hold back Ukraine's advance. The Leopard 2 tanks began to move their tracks across the fields. If before we used to hear so much about the BMPs, now the transports were called Bradleys, their names shouted in the news. That number of armored vehicles began to move out to meet the Russian defenses. For a year, Putin's army had prepared 3 lines of defense that covered almost the entire border of Zaporizhia Oblast. Dozens of fortifications were built between the small towns in the region, taking up positions that could be defended and reducing the possibility of being flanked. The trenches were set up behind large ditches to stop the advance of armored vehicles. Mines were planted in fertile soil, ready to bloom in fire and smoke as they fueled the destruction of war. Ukrainian propaganda spoke of silence and patience. Neither was possible at that moment. Rumors circulated. and the Russians listened. In the southern region, there would be two vectors for the fronts of combat. One in the western parts of Zaporizhia, targeting the strategic cities of Melitopol occupied by Russia, and the other front in the eastern parts of Zaporizhia, targeting Berdyansk on the coast of the Sea of Azov. In June, the Ukrainians were marching in silence with no video, no propaganda. The information channels fell silent, anxiously waiting. It was the Russians who spoke first when the videos came. The first images were of pure horror. Ukrainian tanks from brigades like the 47th, the 37th, the 35th advanced proudly to fulfill their promise of success and repeat last year's actions. Leopard and Bradley seemed to live up to all the dreams sold by the Western media. Each of these promises shattered when the first mine was triggered and fire sprang from the ground to feed the soldiers' lives with terror. The armored vehicles had moved in a line, some very close to each other. The succession of explosions seemed like an orchestra prepared by the Russians to warn that this year everything would be different. The ambush threw the troops into panic, not knowing where to escape as the metal of the armored vehicles was simply torn apart. A Bradley tried to fire towards the trees, providing cover for the others to start their escape. It continuously fired at the Russians, attacking them with RPGs. Tanks could feel the impact of the projectiles coming their way. Other vehicles passed in front of the Bradley but met a fate similar to the first ones that were still burning nearby. One of the Bradleys exploded, throwing the men inside out. The soldiers desperately tried to get out of the armored vehicles, opening the doors as they felt the heat of destruction ripping away their hope. They huddled behind the wreckage, hearing the gunfire crack against the armor and the fire feeding on the fuel, trying to reach the flesh of the men. The soldiers began throwing smoke grenades to create cover so they could escape. They had to climb onto the still intact vehicle. Others provided cover from behind their own armored vehicles while they waited for the chance to be evacuated from that terror. They busied themselves checking who was wounded and shouted for help over the radio. They fired in the direction of the Russians to try to suppress the relentless gunfire. The Russian artillery showed no mercy. The soldiers of the 191st Motorized Regiment and the 100th Motorized Brigade were in different positions on the front, bombarding the Ukrainian armored vehicles with 152mm missile howitzers. The Boyevaya Machina, 22-grad launchers were also firing at the same rate, increasing the level of horror for the Ukrainians in both directions. The destructive power of the Bradley was no longer the most talked about. Their mobility to escape the massacre, or the fact that they protected their crew much more efficiently than Russian vehicles, became the new Western propaganda. The strategy of those initial advances was a disaster that cost the Ukrainians dearly. Lacking air support and without the necessary defenses, they sent their battalions in columns to be slaughtered. They hadn't learned from the Russians the danger of showing so much power in open terrain. The K-52s took off with the pilots' faces lit up with smiles. Their rotors spun freely as they went hunting. The target was armored vehicles moving defenselessly. The Vikor anti-tank missiles were fired from a distance of up to 12 kilometers. The 12-kilogram warhead tore through the armor of Ukrainian vehicles indifferent to propaganda or origin. Entire columns were destroyed by the helicopters. An attempt to take one of them out demonstrated the maneuverability of the K-52. The missile came close and the helicopter left the battlefield already satisfied with the despair it had instilled in the hearts of the Ukrainians. The tense situation increased day by day in June. The minefields proved to be a problem for which no one had an answer that didn't involve the absurd cost of lives. The mines were planted by the Russians in various ways, many of them entering the ground after being deployed by the engineering remote mining system Zaporizhia. The equipment could sow minefields at a distance of 5 to 15 kilometers. It consisted of the launcher vehicle and the truck that carried the ammunition. That threat increased even more the horror of the men who knew the danger as they were forced to advance. Lost in the middle of the mines, the soldiers needed to be rescued. Oleg, a combat medic, waited for the Bradley vehicle to approach and the door to open. He saw his nervous comrades beside him as the armored vehicle moved. It was up to Oleg to volunteer for that job since someone wounded was anxiously waiting for salvation. He removed the sling so the rifle wouldn't throw him off balance. He looked nervously at the mission, thinking about how to get there. He walked along the ramp, still protected, his eyes fixed on the wounded man ahead. He took a deep breath, stared at the ground, thinking about the recent fate of his colleagues. Then he jumped. Oleg was there after a struggle to rescue the wounded in the middle of the field. Moments earlier, doctors had braved the minefield. Every step had to be careful. They knew those mines weren't there to kill. Their main purpose was to cause enough harm to force other soldiers to risk themselves and spend their energy helping the wounded. One of the medics was almost caught by that fate when returning to his vehicle. The explosion shot up toward his leg, seeking to feed on flesh and bone, but he escaped with the limb still intact. Frightened, he leaned against the Bradley, seeing the danger his friends were still in. The armored vehicle pulled back to the protection of the others. The men began to carry another wounded man. The steps felt like a move in a game board set up by death itself. The absence of an explosion was followed by a relieved sigh every time a foot touched the ground. Delivering another wounded man was a mission accomplished, but there were others and the game was not over yet. The Reaper gave his skeletal smile as he rolled the dice with his bony hands. One of the soldiers tried to go back the same way he had dared during the rescue, but the dice roll did not give him the same luck. Mere centimeters led him to destruction. The smell of death was mixed with the groans and gunpowder in the air. Nervous, the men realized that the worst had not yet come. The risk of artillery made them retreat while one of their own was still down. That was when it was Oleg's turn. He went back to the battlefield to save that last life. He knew very well that there was no alternative but to enter the game of death once again. Bradley moved and he positioned himself on the ramp for a jump that would define his existence. He threw himself into a crater created by a previous bombing. But all the equipment threw him off balance and made him fall onto one of his knees. One more centimeter, a wrong move on the board of death, and the mine bit into his leg like an angry monster coming from the ground. The loose limb was desperate. There was no adrenaline that could ease the pain. He quickly put on the tourniquet, searching for something still intact to tie it to and stop the blood that was profusely draining the life he had left. He reached out for help, but his brother in arms would be susceptible to the same fate. He was forced to crawl through the grass, feeling the remains of his legs slowing him down and the open wound scraping against the vegetation. And inside the armored vehicle, Oleg saw how the last of his brothers could be saved. They left the place with one more wounded, and all of them marked forever by the terror of the minefield in their bodies or spirits. By the end of those first days of June, the news was only of disaster. The Russians celebrated their victories by watching videos of destruction. So many Ukrainian armored vehicles became scrap metal. The strategy now was represented by a graveyard of burning tanks under the Ukrainian summer, and men heading to hospitals, leaving behind parts of their bodies and their hopes. The intensity of the fighting affected the mind of every soldier on the battlefield. The entire Zaporizhia front and western Donetsk were filled with explosions. From there, messages were sent to the families of Ukrainians, Russians, and other nationalities who were in the war on either side. The month of June dragged on as slowly as the counteroffensive, and the world was pressing, without understanding that lives were at stake. With each advance, the original strategies weren't working. The columns were heading on a collision course. With the Russians, they only encountered mines or missiles. The Ukrainians went through terrifying moments. with their armored vehicles roaming through open fields while the ammunition exploded. Around them inside, the soldiers felt the impacts of the nearby explosions. Vibrating through the metal, they sweated as they heard the terror spreading side by side. The storm shadows were prepared back in June. That same month, death began to fly through the skies of the trio. At least 10 Su-24S were modified to carry the missiles. The projectiles flew at 323 meters per second, with a 450-kilogram warhead aiming first at the Chandar Bridge. Other targets were also hit, such as Lieutenant General Sergei Goryachev, making him the highest-ranking Russian officer killed in the conflict. Gradually, the plans changed. The new tests were carried out with the Ukrainian artillery taking a new direction. High-mobility artillery rocket systems were taken to the borders. The vehicles with multiple guided missile launch systems were capable of firing 6 of those deadly shots that could reach up to 499 kilometers depending on the ammunition used. An M31 with a 91-kilogram warhead could reach 92 kilometers with a 91-kilogram warhead. The extended range guided multiple launch rocket system could reach up to 150 kilometers. The Russian equipment started to sense the heat of the flames in the same way as the Ukrainians. Entire supply convoys were destroyed. Boyevaya Machina, 21 Red so powerful became a pyre. The precious engineering remote mining system mine launchers were also targeted, not just vehicles burned. On the distant island of Jarelyak, a Russian training center was detected by Ukrainian drones. Unaware of the threat, the soldiers gathered in large numbers while their coordinates were coldly calculated. The arrival of the missile eliminated the men before they could advance to the front. The Ukrainian shock drones were observing this entire offensive. They were part of the information network to detect the Russians in the trenches. They were used to assess the presence of equipment with the Buk air defense system. The anti-aircraft battery was capable of destroying planes up to 42 kilometers away at an altitude of 25,000 meters. Even so, it turned into another pile of metal scattered across Ukraine. The soldiers in the trench fell victim to the same drone surveillance. Detected inside the trenches, they became targets for tanks when they were without the proper protection of their own artillery, which had been destroyed. The armored vehicles approached, firing repeatedly at men whose only protection were the holes they had dug. The ammunition reserves exploded under the bombardment, becoming another danger amid the smoke and the trees. Gradually, the first reports of success began to emerge in the offensive. In Robotyne to the southwest, the Ukrainians forced their way into the city. In the direction of Berdyansk, the first villages under Russian control were gradually being taken, with confirmation from Putin's own propagandists. Belika, Novozilka, Deskutin, Makarivka and Rivnopil fell back in June. It wasn't easy. In Makarivka, the Russians demonstrated aggressiveness in the actions of their tanks. The Ukrainians had taken most of the settlement when the lone T-80 from the 136th Motorized Rifle Brigade appeared at almost 80 kilometers per hour on the road in the south of the city. The 125mm cannon aimed precisely at the BMC Kirk. The explosion engulfed most of the crew in flames and made the wounded stumble out. Some died still on the ground near the burning vehicle. Fearing retaliation, the T-80 retreated. Realizing that no one was trying anything, the tank turned around and charged again, passing between the destroyed houses. It positioned itself to torment the Ukrainians once again. Meanwhile, a drone descended on it, dropping kilograms of explosives onto the armor. Resisting but aware of the new danger, the T-80 retreated, and another position was secured at great cost by the Ukrainians. The direct advance against the trenches was still difficult. The strategy of destroying enemy artillery and then distracting the entrenched Russians with bombardment from the tanks was one of the alternatives. The Ukrainians then moved along the tree line, trying to catch the enemies by surprise. The special forces of the 73 Degrees Naval Center crawled through the grass until they reached the cover of the trees. They walked silently, listening to the shots fired at the Russians by the infantry. The enemy did not notice the soldiers entering the cover. The weapons began to fire muffled sounds at every corner, anticipating the possibility that a Russian might be waiting. They appeared little by little, turning in a desperate search for weapons. They found the Ukrainian barrels almost touching their chests. The bullets pierced their skin, letting their souls escape through the holes. There was no time for forgiveness or mercy. The operators made sure those who had fallen were finished. They only advanced when stepping over corpses. The Russians kept moving toward the Ukrainians, crouching to seek the protection of the trench and limiting their view of the death that awaited them ahead. Their eyes met the ground and their souls found the path to the afterlife. The operators shouted for the enemies to surrender, but heard nothing in return, except for the gunfire exchanged with the infantry further ahead. Ukrainian grenades flew over the holes, trying to force the Russians to move even more. They responded with their own explosives, separating one of the operators from the group. Sweat ran down his forehead, soaking his balaclava as he stopped at one of the corners. He reloaded, knowing he should stay there. Moving alone in a confined environment with so many possibilities was like crawling into the Reaper's embrace. He waited, and another Russian came. He already seemed armed, but the weapon in his hand was insignificant when walking in the trench with the gun pointed down and only his eyes on the aggressor. He was struck down by a succession of shots that allowed the operator to rejoin the group. The infantry appeared shortly after. They cleared the rest of the trench of Russian presence. It was another position gained through sweat and blood, not to mention the tears that would still be shed by many families. The war would continue with the difficult advances of the Ukrainians. In Luhansk, the Russians would launch a new offensive, gaining a few kilometers, while their opponents secured positions to the south. Pro-Russian commentators celebrated the few kilometers gained in the east and criticized the limited advances of the Ukrainians in the south. The pro-Ukrainians made the opposite comments. Both sides forgot about the high cost in lives for every meter gained. There was still a long way to go if either side wanted a significant victory.